March 1978. Jeffrey Rignall didn't know where he was when he was awakened from the heavy haze of unconsciousness. Did know, however, was that something was very, very wrong. The man who had given him a ride was pouring himself a cocktail in an unfamiliar living room. Jeffrey felt groggy, disoriented, confused. He asked the man what was happening, and the man calmly, coldly replied, "There's a gun behind the bar, and I'd just as soon kill you as look at you." Before Jeffrey could say anything, the man once more placed a chloroform rag over his mouth. When Jeffrey awakened again, he was suspended from the ceiling, his upper half locked in a pillory, his bottom half fastened to boards by chains. Before him, the man who gave him a ride was standing naked, an array of paraphernalia and weapons before him. What happened to Jeffrey next is unthinkable. For hours he was taken advantage of, brutalized, and repeatedly knocked unconscious by chloroform. He was within inches of his life multiple times until he woke up here. Beneath this statue in Lincoln Park in Chicago is where Jeffrey Rignall awakened from his horrible ordeal, believing that he was already dead. He was alive, but, as the Courier-Journal reported, most days after, he wished he wasn't. It was this 26-year-old man, a gay college graduate from Kentucky, who was the first to identify the man who brutally assaulted him, the first to link police to one of the most prolific serial killers of all time, John Wayne Gacy. At the time Jeffrey was attacked by Gacy, there were already 29 bodies buried beneath the crawlspace of the home he was tortured inside. But the murders didn't stop there. This is the story of the victims of John Wayne Gacy, where they were hidden, and the system that allowed Gacy to walk free much longer than he needed to. To some of his employees and some members of the queer community, Gacy was a problem, a menace. His inappropriate behavior was spread in hushed whispers from one person to the next. But to the wider public, Gacy was a picture-perfect member of the community. He was a director of parades in Chicago, giving him special clearance to meet First Lady Rosalind Carter. He was a husband and father. He ran his own business, managed several more, and was looked up to by dozens of his employees. He was a vice president of the United States Junior Chamber, a source of both wisdom and companionship for many. On top of that, he was Pogo the Clown, entertaining hospitalized children and performing at fundraising events for free. He went above and beyond in his community, which is one of the many reasons that police seem to refuse to look his way for quite some time. But Gacy's story is a long one, and sadly, the time police spent looking for him is just a small snippet of his long, tumultuous life. Gacy's childhood. Gacy was born in 1942, smack dab in the middle of World War II and the peak of the traditional family. His father, who was a veteran of the First World War, worked as a mechanic. His mother, who was Gacy's rock, was a homemaker who spent all of her time doting on her two daughters and her only son. But Gacy's father was far from doting. Perhaps it was a result of his own chaotic upbringing, his time in the trenches of Europe, or his own struggles in an oppressively masculine society. But Gacy's father was seemingly terrified of his son being different, and he lashed out with cruelty to ensure that he wasn't. From a young age, many people report that Gacy's father berated him, calling him a sissy, dumb, and stupid. As he crept towards adolescence, Gacy's father allegedly beat him, telling him that he was a mama's boy who would probably grow up to be queer. Gacy's mother reportedly tried to protect Gary from the abuse of his father, but she likely had as little power against the man of the house as her children did. And Gacy, after all, was just a child. He told later reporters that he deeply, desperately loved his father, but that he felt he would never receive his father's approval. When he finally would years later, that approval wouldn't last long. None of these glimpses at Gacy's childhood are meant to excuse his horrific behavior or paint him as a victim. Rather, They are helpful information that forms the foundation of Gacy's life and his perverse behavior. The first time Gacy was subject to sexual matter of any kind, he was just a young boy. One of his father's friends began to molest Gacy any chance that he was alone with him, skewing his perspective and igniting his curiosity and sexual behavior at a devastatingly young age. Around the same time, Gacy was caught fondling a young girl in the company of another boy his age. His father whipped him repeatedly for his transgression. Gacy never told his mother or father about the molestation he was subjected to. He feared that his father would blame him, and so the terrible secret simmered inside him. But Gacy slowly began to rebel against the control of his father. When he was 18, his father purchased him a car, keeping himself as the sole title owner. This was likely an attempt to maintain control of Gacy as he went out into the workforce, and it worked. When Gacy wouldn't do as his father said, his father would withhold the keys to the car, preventing Gacy from reporting to work or going about his necessary duties. At 18, he was far from free, and his frustration was mounting. At 20, Gacy bought a separate set of keys for himself. His father, furious by this perceived disobedience, dismantled part of Gacy's car, rendering it inoperable for 3 days. That was the final straw for Gacy. As soon as his car was running, he fled to Las Vegas with just over $100 to his name. Things aren't right. 1962. Gacy couldn't sleep. He was 20, scraping together change working as a mortuary assistant, so desperate that he was sleeping in a back room just feet away from the dead bodies he was tasked with taking care of. But it wasn't fear, disgust, or sadness that was keeping him from sleeping. It was excitement and arousal. In the next room, an innocent 16-year-old boy laid in a casket. His life was cut tragically short, and he was being prepared for his burial. Gacy gazed at the boy at length before he succumbed to his horrific desires and climbed inside the casket. He spent the night fondling, cuddling, and committing necrophilic acts with the corpse of an underage boy. This was allegedly Gacy's first time as an adult crossing the line into his demented desires, and it was far from his last. Gacy later claimed that he committed necrophilia with the corpses of 2 young boys. He wore their clothes, spoke to them in hushed whispers, and caressed them. It wasn't long before the mortuary director suspected that something was deeply wrong. He called the police on Gacy, unsure of what exactly was happening, but suspecting the worst. He was right to do so. Unfortunately, the police had no proof and therefore nothing to investigate. It was unknown for certain, but many people suspect that it was this incident that prompted Gacy to flee back home to Chicago. For years following this incident, Gacy didn't outwardly act on his twisted compulsions, but that didn't last for long. The Club, 1964. In 1964, Gacy married his first wife, Marilyn Myers. The happy couple moved to Waterloo, Iowa, where Marilyn's father had purchased multiple KFC restaurants that he tasked Gacy with managing. This gave Gacy a steady stream of income. But perhaps more importantly for him, it gave him a steady stream of young, impressionable teenage boys under his control. Pedophiles will often actively seek out job opportunities that put them in close, constant contact with children and teens that they can take advantage of. In Gacy's case, as with much of his life, he went above and beyond this. He created a basement hangout in his house where his teenage employees could come to relax, drink, and play pool with an adult who, in their eyes, saw them as cool, mature equals. In reality, Gacy was doing all that he could to earn his teen employees' trust in order to take advantage of them. For years, he would supply his employees with alcohol, and when they were drunk enough, he would make sexual advances on them. If the employees were able to reject him or stand up to him, Gacy would praise them, claiming that he was simply testing their morals. If they were unable to, Gacy would pounce. It wasn't just Gacy's employees that were at his targets, however. Because at the same time he was running the club for teenagers in his basement, he was surrounding himself with teenagers at the local JC's chapter. And one teenager there in particular would lead to the end of this self-described perfect part of Gacy's life. The Politician's Son, 1967. Donald Voorhees Jr. had a promising life ahead of him. The son of an Iowa politician, he was a member of the local JC's chapter to be mentored, learn about business, and learn how to be successful. At the same time, he was just 15. So when his mentor, 25-year-old Gacy, invited him over to his house with the promise of letting him see a sex film for the very first time, Don trusted him and leapt at the opportunity. When he arrived, Gacy filled him with alcohol, showed him the film, and then coerced him into performing oral sex. Gacy reportedly told the young, impressionable boy that in order to have sex with a woman, he had to first have sex with a man. Donald held the secret of the horrible assault inside him for months. Meanwhile, Gacy continued to assault every mentee that he could. He told many that he was conducting scientific research and offered them $50 for him to conduct sexual acts on them. Others he blackmailed into performing acts on him. The teenagers were all scared, unsure of what to do about what happened to them. Not only is assault at such an age a life-changing, horrific ordeal, but at the time, homosexuality was viewed as one of the ultimate sins. To confess that they had engaged in homosexual activity, even against their will, took immense bravery. Which is likely why it wasn't until March of 1968 that the truth came to light for the very first time. Donald confessed to his father in tears that Gacy had sexually assaulted him more than 6 months prior. Fortunately, and unusual for the time, Donald's father believed him and called the police. Gacy was indicted on a sodomy charge for his assault of Donald. He hired one of his employees, an 18-year-old named Russell Schroeder, to beat up 15-year-old Donald and threatened to do more if he testified against Gacy. Once more, Donald was incredibly brave and reported this to the police. As a result, Gacy was charged with hiring someone to assault and intimidate a victim. He was sentenced to 10 years, an unusually long sentence at the time for such a crime. It's likely that this sentencing was influenced by the psychological evaluation of Gacy, which stated that he had antisocial personality disorder. Psychologists agreed that Gacy was unlikely to recover from treatment and was highly likely to reoffend. Yet, after just 18 months in prison, Gacy was released on good behavior and sent back to Chicago with only 2 minor stipulations. He had to live with his mother, and he had to be home by nightfall each day. The Greyhound Busboy, 1972. January 2nd, the Windy City is cold, blustery, and settling into a brand new year after the Christmas rush. Timothy Jack McCoy was thrilled to explore it. At just 16, Tim had seen more of the country than most people do in their entire lives. He had lived in Nebraska, California, Florida, and Iowa, and frequently traveled cross-country to visit his extended family members. He was a chatty teenager, eager to make people laugh and smiling almost constantly. He loved to regale those close to him with stories about his favorite musicians, especially Creedence Clearwater Revival. He was already working as a forklift operator at this young age, and his worldliness set him up for a life of joy and success. On Christmas, he had visited his relatives in Michigan. At the end of the holidays, his cousins dropped him off at a bus station. He promised to call once he made it home to Omaha, but he never did. Because on that blustery morning, John Wayne Gacy found Tim at the Greyhound station in Chicago. His bus to Omaha wasn't scheduled until noon the following day, so Gacy offered to give the young man a tour of Chicago. A trusting traveler by nature, Tim agreed to go with him. All that we know beyond this is what Gacy has told the police, though they refuse to believe most of his story. Gacy told law enforcement that after showing Tim the city, they returned to Gacy's home, where he promised the teenager a place to sleep for the night. Gacy claims that they then had consensual sex, though police believe this was said as an attempt by Gacy to soften the crime that he committed and absolve him of some blame. Gacy claims that they fell asleep. In the morning, he awakened to see Tim standing in his doorway with a knife in his hand. Gacy leapt out of bed and tried to grab the knife from Tim. Gacy and Tim tumbled to the ground, where Gacy threatened to kill Tim and eventually stabbed him multiple times in the chest. Gacy claims that he went to the kitchen. He noticed breakfast had been made and plates had been set out for two. Allegedly, Tim had simply made breakfast for himself and Gacy and had forgotten to put the knife down before waking Gacy. Because his mother was due to visit that afternoon, Gacy hid Tim's body in a horrific place that would take 7 more years to be uncovered. Tragically, it would then be more than 10 years before Tim's body was identified. During the murder of Tim, Gacy claims that he experienced mind-numbing sexual arousal. In his own words, "That's when I realized that death was the ultimate thrill." And so, his new goal in life was established. The first of the unknown. In total, Gacy had 33 known victims. To this day, 6 of them are unidentified. His second murder, which took place between 1972 and 1975, is one of these unidentified victims. The man was Caucasian, believed to be anywhere between 14 to his early 20s. He wore a plain silver-colored ring on his left ring finger, indicating that he may have been married, or perhaps was wearing a promise ring or purity ring. He was 5'9" and likely suffered a fracture in his right humerus at some point in his young life. Tragically, that life was cut short by Gacy. Gacy gave little information to the police about this young victim, aside from telling them that he strangled the young man to death and then stuffed him in his closet. He claims that the body began to leak, oozing decomposition fluids on his carpet, so he was forced to dispose the body where he would eventually dispose of 26 others. If you had a loved one or know of a young man fitting this description that went missing in the early 1970s, or was reported missing sometime between 1970 and 1980, please contact Cook County Sheriff's Department at 708-865-6244. The Trap. As the early 1970s ticked on, Gacy's way of luring and trapping victims evolved and shifted. He became a predator in every sense of the word. After moving on from his position in the JCs and his role as a manager of KFCs, he found another way to get teens and young adult men under his control by running a construction business. In his position of power, he would often proposition his workers for sex, offer to lend them vehicles and money in exchange for sex, and much like he had in earlier years, supply them with alcohol in order to coerce them. Some victims were coerced into getting into Gacy's car by promises of alcohol and drugs. Once they entered his vehicle, he would chloroform them, take them home, and brutally assault them. Other strangers were tricked into getting in Gacy's car. Gacy had a fake police badge and lights and would frequently pull people over pretending to be an officer. Once they were pulled into his vehicle, he would bring them home, beat them, and sexually assault them. Then there were the victims that he knew. With the victims that he knew, usually friends or employees, he would bring them to his house to drink, then offer to show them tricks from his routine as Pogo the Clown. For one of his tricks, he would handcuff himself behind his back, then escape the handcuffs and offer to show his victims how to escape. Instead, the second the handcuffs were on them, Gacy would begin to sexually assault them and taunt them. Gacy's wide-ranging methods proved that this wasn't just about the murder and assault for him. It was about the manipulation and the game he was playing. This is proven even more by the twisted things Gacy said to many of his victims while he was assaulting them. Gacy would make comments relating to his tricks as a clown. When the time came to murder his victims, he would often tauntingly tell them that it was time for his rope trick, which would be his final trick of the evening. Gacy would then place a rope tourniquet around the victim's neck and tighten the tourniquet repeatedly using the handle of a hammer. Sometimes, the victims would be choked and repeatedly brought back for up to 2 hours. Other times, Gacy would dunk them in a bathtub, repeatedly drowning them and reviving them before he would finally choke them and end their suffering. The poor men that died at the hands of Gacy had brutal, inhumane endings. Leading up to their death, Gacy would burn cigars on them, call them names, beat them, and force them to do embarrassing acts, like pretend to be a horse while Gacy sat on their backs. Between his employees and the strangers he would coerce into his car, Gacy's victims began to stack up. But they didn't have to. Because between 1975 and 1978, police were given Gacy's name by victims' families and witnesses dozens of times. And yet, they did not act. The victims' families. Title card, July 31, 1975. John Butkovich was just 18 years old and an incredibly hard worker at Gacy's construction business, PDM. Yet, Gacy took advantage of him in more ways than one. Gacy owed Butkovich a large sum of money in back pay. He told his family that he was going to confront his boss about his unpaid wages. That was the last time his family saw him. Because when young, brave Butkovich went to confront Gacy, Gacy coaxed him into his car under the promise that they would discuss the pay civilly at his home. When they arrived, however, Gacy sat on his chest, handcuffed him, assaulted him, and strangled him. Butkovich's father called Gacy, desperate to find out where his son was, and Gacy's response was shockingly nonchalant. He said he'd help the family look for him, but that he was certain Butkovich had run away. Over the next 3 years, while Gacy was committing dozens of murders, Butkovich's parents called the police over 100 times, practically begging them to investigate Gacy in their son's disappearance. Gacy had a record of assaulting young boys, yet police didn't look into him. Still, the calls came rolling in. Title card, December 1976. It wasn't like 17-year-old Gary Godzik to not come home. He was a good boy with a flourishing social life, a close relationship with his parents, and a girlfriend who he loved dearly. He started working for PDM and Gacy in November, eager to make money of his own. But soon after he told his parents that he was going to help Gacy dig trenches in his crawl space, he disappeared. Godzik's parents called Gacy repeatedly, desperate for answers about the disappearance of their son. Gacy told them that Godzik had told them that he had wanted to run away, and he had even left a voicemail on Gacy's answering machine claiming such. When the family desperately asked if they could listen to the voicemail, Gacy coldly told them that he had erased it. Once more, the police did nothing. They didn't look into Gacy and hardly looked for Godzik, who they also believed to have run away. In the year that followed Godzik's murder, Gacy murdered at least 12 more innocent young men. Then there was Robert Donnelly. Title card, December 1977. Robert was 19, a college student with big dreams. He was standing at a bus stop in Chicago when Gacy approached him, distracted him with a question, and then pulled a gun on him, ordering him to get in the car. What awaited him at Gacy's house is beyond comprehension. Robert was tortured, assaulted, and repeatedly drowned in the bathtub for hours. Gacy taunted him throughout the brutal attack, saying horrific things such as, "Aren't we having fun tonight?" Robert was in more pain than any human being should have to experience. At one point, as he was being repeatedly drowned and brought back to life, he begged Gacy to kill him. Gacy responded that he was getting around to it. When Robert awakened, he was laying on the ground outside of his workplace in Chicago. Gacy stood over him and told them that if he complained to the police wouldn't believe a word he said. Tragically, Gacy was right. When Robert Donnelly reported what had happened to him, including Gacy's name and address to the police, they ordered Gacy to come to the station. Gacy told them a different story. He attacked Robert's character, claiming that they had a relationship where Robert consensually served as his slave and Gacy acted as his master. Police believed Gacy and didn't touch the matter again. It's likely that police only believed Gacy because they didn't want to pursue any crime that could be related to homosexuality. At the time, crime against queer individuals was largely ignored by law enforcement, leading to hundreds, if not thousands, of queer individuals being killed and abused without receiving justice. A few days later, Gacy murdered 19-year-old William Kindred. Title card: March 21, 1978. Just 2 months later, Jeffrey Rignall, the man we began this documentary with, was at the police station reporting a similar incident. Unlike Robert, however, Jeffrey couldn't remember the name or address of the man who assaulted him. He told police the details of what he could remember: the expressway sign that the house was off of, the Oldsmobile the man was driving, even the appearance of the man. But police didn't act nor search for the man that attacked Rignall. Once more, this is likely because the sex crime occurred between two men. For weeks, Rignall and his friends tried to find out the identity of the man who had attacked him. They staked out roads Rignall remembered and eventually spotted the Oldsmobile matching the description. When Rignall followed the vehicle to its house, Rignall knew it was the home he had been brutally assaulted in. It was 8213 West Summerdale, the home of John Wayne Gacy. It was only after Rignall did his own investigation that charges were pressed against Gacy. On July 15, Gacy was facing battery and assault charges for nearly murdering Rignall. And yet, he was allowed to walk free and continue to murder innocent people. At this point, the place where he had been stowing the 29 bodies was full. So, he began to throw bodies into the Des Plaines River from the bridge on I-95. Robert Piest, December 11, 1978. Robert Piest was 15 years old and wise and hard-working beyond his years. When Gacy went to Nissan Pharmacy, where he worked part-time to discuss renovations, he told Piest that he was looking to hire teenage boys for an incredibly high rate. Piest leapt at the option. When his mother offered him a ride home to celebrate her birthday, Piest told his mother that he was going to talk to a contractor about a job. But by 10 p.m. that night, Piest was dead. Gacy choked him and assaulted him in the same room where he had murdered dozens of others. Thankfully, Piest was his last victim, all thanks to a single police officer, Joseph Kozenzak. When Piest's family told police that Gacy was the last person Piest had been seen with, Kozenzak decided to be the first law enforcement officer to actually look into Gacy's history. This is believed to be largely because of his son, who was the same age as Piest and attended the same school. When he uncovered the battery charge against Rignall and the sodomy charge he had received in Iowa, Kozenzak realized that he was onto something. Des Plaines police served Gacy with a search warrant on December 13th, fearing that Piest may be being held captive within the home. Inside, they discovered a horrific array of items: a pistol, police badges, pornographic movies, bottles of sedative drugs, chloroform, sex toys, syringes, handcuffs, and books appealing to pedophiles. In addition, there was an array of clothes that appeared to belong to teenage boys, including underwear. Police launched into several weeks of surveillance on Gacy. Throughout the weeks, he repeatedly taunted police, going so far as to invite them to dinner to tell them, "You know, clowns can get away with murder." After multiple interviews, including with Rossi, a young man who had been ordered to spread lime in Gacy's crawlspace, police had what they needed to conduct another search warrant of Gacy's property. This time, their search was more thorough. This time, Gacy knew they had him. The crawlspace. Title card, December 21, 1978. It was a hot enough day that law enforcement could smell the decomposing bodies in the home. Yet, it would take endless hours of work to uncover all of them. Buried in the crawlspace beneath Gacy's house were the remains of 26 people. As he began to murder young men, he buried them beneath the very space he was living in, unashamedly laughing, dancing, and drinking above their corpses. In a drunken stupor, Gary confessed the murders to his attorney as law enforcement searched his home. He told him that he had murdered more than 30 people, buried them in his crawlspace and yard, and thrown them in the river. He fell asleep during his confession, then rushed out the door in an anxious, manic state. He frantically drove to the homes of his friends, even going so far as crying and telling them that he'd been a bad boy and murdered 30 people. In the early morning hours of December 22nd, Gacy confessed to police that he had murdered 33 people. At his trial, two of his known victims, Rignall and Donald Voorhees, struggled to relive their horrible experiences. Rignall vomited on the stand, and Donald was asked to step down because he could hardly speak. Thankfully, Gacy was charged on all counts and sentenced to death. On May 9, 1994, Gacy was executed. His final words were reportedly, "Kiss my ass," and he showed no remorse for his heinous crimes. These are the known victims that were killed at the hands of John Wayne Gacy. Timothy Jack McCoy, 16. John Butkovich, 18. Darrell Julius Sampson, 18. Randall Wayne Reffett, 15. Samuel G. Dodd Stapleton, 14. Michael Lawrence Bonin, 17. William Huey Carroll Jr., 16. James Byron Hawkinson, 16. Rick Lewis Johnston, 17. Kenneth Ray Parker, 16. Michael M. Marino, 14. William George Bundy, 19. Francis Wayne Alexander, 21. Gregory John Godzik, 17. John Allen Sick, 19. John Stephen Prestige, 20. Matthew Walter Bowman, 19. Robert Edward Gilroy Jr., 18. John Anthony Mowry, 19. Russell Lloyd Nelson, 21. Robert David Winch, 16. Tommy Joe Bowling, 20. David Paul Talsma, 19. William Wayne Kindred, 19. Timothy David O'Rourke, 20. Frank William Landingen, 19. James Mazzara, 20. Robert Jerome Peast, 15. In addition, Gacy has 5 victims who are unidentified. All of the victims are white males, estimated to be in their teens or early 20s. Cook County Sheriff is looking for any help they can in identifying the bodies. If you had a family member go missing between 1970 and 1979, please contact them at 708-865-6244. Let us know in the comments what you think about this case. Remember to subscribe if you like this video. You will most definitely like the video about a suspected doctor that surgically dissected a young woman and did horrible things to her while she was still alive. Keep sleuthing, armchair detectives. Until next time.